Thank you, Ron, Kathy, and Elizabeth. Beautiful, beautiful. May your pillow catch fire. Early on the morning of August 14th, 1942, Nazi soldiers surrounded the Jewish ghetto in the town of Bobowa, Poland, and began rounding up all the men, women, and children. Terrified and still in his pajamas, 12-year-old Samuel Oliner hid on a roof and watched the terrible chaos below. Here, in his own words, is what happened next to him. After several hours, which seemed like a lifetime, I escaped from the ghetto. Peasants along the way told me what had happened. The trucks had taken the others, including my entire family, to a forest. There the Nazi soldiers forced them to undress in the most vile and humiliating way, and then made them walk about 60 feet across huge planks laid across a mass grave. They then shot them and watched them fall into the grave. It took 18 hours to kill those 1,000 people and bury them with a thin coat of soil. After that, Oliner went on, I wandered around the countryside for 3 days, dazed and in disbelief. I slept in barns or in fields and ate food off the land. Finally, I decided to go across the hills to the village of Bystra, where a Catholic woman named Balwina Pajciuch lived. Balwina knew my family from before the war. When I knocked on her door one night, Balwina immediately recognized me. She knew what had happened at Bobowa. She saw how scared and disheveled I was. She took me in and comforted me, hugged me, fed me, and offered to let me sleep in her attic. As I climbed the stairs, Balwina said, crying, "You poor boy, I will help. You must live." Balwina changed my name and taught me how to pretend to be a Catholic and helped me find a job in a nearby farm. Thus it was that I survived the war. And then Oliner concludes, Balwina Pajciuch's act of kindness, compassion, and bravery not only saved my life, it formed my life. I emigrated to the United States after the war, became a sociologist, and spent my career understanding what motivates altruists like Balwina and the hundreds of thousands of other people during the war who put the welfare of others right alongside their own. Here is a picture of the eminent sociologist, Dr. Samuel Oliner, who is now 90 years old and professor emeritus at Humboldt State University in Northern California, a pioneering thinker who has devoted his very long and distinguished career to the study of altruism and compassion in human beings. And what, you might ask, has Dr. Oliner discovered about good people like Balwina Pajciuch? After he and his research team from the Altruistic Personality and Pro-Social Behavior Institute he founded at Humboldt State, interviewed more than 1,500 of what are now known as the righteous Gentiles, those brave non-Jewish Europeans who risked everything and endangered their own lives to rescue Jews. He's concluded that the one defining human quality these exceptional people all shared is that of empathy. Empathy simply for other people. It was empathy, pure and simple, that made these people so compassionate and brave. Again, Oliner, in his own words, we found a clear correlation between empathy and altruistic behavior. These helpers of humanity could simply not stand by and see others suffer. altruists, unlike bystanders who did not help, had internalized somehow an ethic of caring and social responsibility which they had learned from their parents or other adult models. They all shared, he concludes, the capacity for love and compassion. Now, as a religious leader who has been thinking about our impossibly complex and difficult human drama for almost half a century now, I am passionately persuaded that empathy is one of the most important spiritual and ethical possessions anyone can have. Empathy is something we must both cherish and teach in our religious communities, and most certainly teach to our children and youth here at UUFVB. Again, Samuel Oleiner. Moral behavior is the consequence of empathy. Caring for others, a strong attachment to the moral community, and an ethical obligation to all life. Reaching out to others, he goes on, at considerable personal risk, as Balwina Paitruch did to me, that terrified 12-year-old boy, has been a force, the force, behind much that is good in our world. It has saved innumerable lives and inspired countless acts of generosity and heroism. The work of Samuel Oleiner and his research team, along with other researchers in this field, has persuaded me that, in fact, empathy, that quiet and unostentatious quality of the heart, is the spiritual prerequisite for compassionate and loving behavior in our lives. It is people infused with a simple, heartfelt empathy for their fellow humans who naturally act in compassionate and protective and altruistic ways. Said simply, it is most often the empathy which is in our hearts that empowers us to be good and caring human beings. It is empathy which leads to compassionate deeds and concrete acts of goodness, not to mention a more humane society. But not everyone in our culture agrees with or believes in the importance of empathy in human affairs. Perhaps some of you remember a decade ago now, during the confirmation process for Justice Sotomayor, that President Obama was harshly criticized by some conservative members of Congress for saying that one of the qualities he was looking for in a Supreme Court justice was empathy. It was as if these congressmen, and yes, they were all men, equated empathy with sentimentality, or the essence of being, quote, a bleeding heart liberal. The assumption seemed to be that a compassionate, empathetic Supreme Court justice would be an undesirable Supreme Court justice. And more recently, our current president, as I'm sure you are all aware, systematically exhibits an almost total lack of empathy toward others who are experiencing misfortune, whether it's in a hurricane or forest fires. He just can't find any empathy. Or the children, the 524 children he separated, his policies separated from their parents in last week's debate. He could not say anything empathetic about what they were going through, other than that they were being well fed and cared for in some stark federal institution. Shameful. In a recent editorial in the Washington Post entitled, We're officially witnessing the total failure of empathy in presidential leadership, conservative Republican writer Michael Gerson points out that at a time in our national life when empathy is desperately needed for those many Americans facing hardship because of COVID and the environmental crisis and the forest fires, the current occupant of the White House, because, as Gerson puts it, his defects of heart and character, has proven himself totally unable to be even the slightest bit empathetic toward others, whether it be toward those who have died or lost their jobs because of the corona epidemic, or, as I say, those suffering from hurricanes or wildfires. I further quote Gerson. The United States is now in desperate need of empathetic leadership. Empathetic leadership serves the purpose of reassuring vulnerable people that someone is on their side. It is not particularly helpful, he goes on, to urge this particular president to grow a soul. He seems totally incapable of such. But empathy in times of crisis is not some altruistic add-on. It is the manner by which a nation suffering is given purpose, and a method of assuring the vulnerable that they will not be forgotten. And then Gerson ends. If the president cannot feel empathy, he needs to fake it. Again, regardless of your station or status in society, empathy is one of the most important moral and spiritual possessions any of us can have. But with all that said about the importance of empathy, the question quickly becomes, what precisely is empathy? And two, is empathy for others something we can in fact cultivate and nurture in our lives and actually instill in our children? Let's begin by defining empathy, by looking at the etymology of the word itself. The English word empathy comes from the Greek word empatheia. Empatheia, the human quality of feeling into or feeling with another, which literally means feeling into. Empathy, then, as several authors that I consulted put it, is the quality of feeling into the situation of another. This is a much stronger human connection to another than sympathy, which I think of as the quality of feeling above, looking at someone and feeling sorry for them from above is sort of sympathy from a distance. While sympathy is an important level of human caring, empathy goes deeper and motivates us to actually do something tangible to relieve the suffering of others. I like the way my colleague Richard Gilbert from Rochester, New York, puts all of this. Empathy, which is feeling the feelings of others, he writes, is at the core of kindness. It is the irrational root of ethics. It is the central ingredient in human compassion. The word compassion, he goes on, comes from the Latin com, meaning together, and pati, meaning to suffer. Thus, the word means literally to suffer together. In German, the word is Mitleid, feeling the misfortune of the other. There are times, Gilbert goes on, when our only response to another's pain is to share it. Sorrow shared is sorrow halved, is an old German saying. Empathy, then, he concludes, comes from a feeling of deep sympathy for another, and it is accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the pain or remove its cause. Sympathy, feeling pity, turns to empathy, feeling with, and finally issues in action to serve the needs of the neighbor, unquote. And empathy, at its best, I think, is not some complicated intellectual process. It is rather a simple emotional one. I am reminded of the story about a 9-year-old girl who was sent by her mother for a loaf of bread at the store, which was a short 5-minute walk down the street from where they lived. When the 9-year-old had not returned home with the bread after half an hour, the mother grew concerned. Just as she was about to set out to see what had become of her daughter, the girl bounded in the door with the loaf of bread. "What on earth kept you so long?" the mother inquired. The daughter answered, "Well, on the way back from the store, I came upon a boy who had fallen off his bike and hurt his leg. I had to stop and help him cry." Empathy, then, pure and simple, is the quality of feeling with or feeling into another's predicament or pain. And because of this close identification with what that person is going through, it causes us to do something good or compassionate about it. So empathy in here leads to compassion and goodness out there. And the absence or total lack of empathy in the heart also, conversely, leads to great evil. I had a wise and learned old colleague on Cape Cod, the Reverend Peter Fleck, a survivor of the Holocaust, who went on to run the Rothschilds' banking interests in the United States, in New York. He was a great, great man. Collins and I have been in his home before he and Ruth both have passed away now. They would be over 100. On his deathbed, he said to Jennifer Justice, the minister in the Provincetown Church that he helped to serve, he said on his deathbed, "I've become convinced that human evil is only possible if you look into the eyes of another human being and do not see God there." As a Unitarian Universalist committed to the theological idea that lies at the center of our faith, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, I am passionately persuaded that this statement of Peter Fleck's is true. If we do not see our beautiful human commonality when we look into the lives or the eyes of another, then we can do great evil to one another. One painful example of this evil that happens when empathy is absent happened recently in the Washington, D.C. area, and it was reported in the Washington Post the next morning. One afternoon, an emotionally distraught woman had climbed over the railing on a high bridge on Interstate 95 over the Rappahannock River, which just runs through Virginia, through the suburbs of Washington. As a state police negotiator tried during rush hour to talk her into his arms and safety, impatient motorists who wanted to get home started yelling, "Jump! Jump!" And she did. But as real as such acts of indifferent cruelty are in human affairs, I want to flip this theological and ethical observation back to the positive. And that's where I want to take you this morning. Another positive way of saying this is that human goodness and compassion blessedly can happen and regularly do happen when we look into the eyes of the situation of another and see the reflection of God, or at least, if you're a humanist, the reflection of your best self. What Balwina Paichuk saw when that knock came at the door that night in 1942 was not some subhuman creature to hate as the Nazis had portrayed the Jews, but simply a precious fellow human being to protect, which she did. All right. So now we know what human empathy is. But then the next critical question I ask is, so can we cultivate this in our hearts? And can we teach? Is this something we can teach to our children? And the good news here, folks, is that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that empathy is a natural human quality that can be cultivated. The good news is that empathy is a natural human quality that can be cultivated. First, it seems clear we are all naturally born with it. In his wonderful book, Emotional Intelligence, Dr. Daniel Goleman asserts that all human beings come into the world with a strong empathetic impulse. The roots of empathy, he writes, can be traced to infancy. Virtually from the day they are born, infants are upset when they hear another infant crying. Infants feel empathetic distress before they even realize fully that they exist apart from other people. a response, he writes, that is the earliest precursor of empathy. And Dr. Harvey Hornstein, in his important little book, Cruelty and Kindness, asserts that parents, teachers, and other adult role models who model empathetic and compassionate behavior in their daily living can and do produce more altruistic, empathetic children. I quote him, "The development of empathetic, altruistic disposition in children is very much contingent upon the quality of parental behavior that the child observes. Parents who shower their children, I should say, with rewarding hugs, kisses, and kindness that they witness after acts of generosity by their children are more likely to rear empathetic, altruistic children than those who are coolly dispassionate when they see their children doing good." Again and again, in his interviews with the righteous Gentiles who saved Jews during World War II, Samuel Oleiner, discovered that these brave and empathetic people learned empathy from their parents. I quote him again, Belwina Pietrich. "My parents taught me to respect all human beings. My parents taught me discipline, tolerance, and service to others when people need something." I am honored to tell you that a couple of years back, when I was writing my first sermon about this whole topic, I had a conversation with Samuel Oleiner himself. Some of you have known me for a while. I was not born with the shyness gene. I may have been born with the empathetic gene, but I was not born with the shyness. So after I read about his research, I looked up Humboldt State University. I found his office phone number, and with great anticipation, I dialed his personal office line, and it went to voicemail. So I sent him the draft of my sermon, sent him my phone number, and 3 days later, he called. And in the Polish accent that he had not been able to get rid of with all these years in the U.S., he called me back, and we had a wonderful 30-minute conversation about my sermon. And he said to me, and I'm going to try to do his little accent a little bit, "Reverend Alexander, I'm very much an optimist about human behavior and goodness." And then he said, "We know it's easy to teach prejudice and hatred. Individuals and communities of people successfully teach hate all the time." But he went on, "I am passionately convinced that we can also teach altruism and empathy at home and in our schools and in churches like yours, where we have a captive audience," he reminded me. "We can teach our children to think and act empathetically and compassionately." And so if the good doctor is right, and I pray and believe he is, empathy is something we can cultivate and instill in ourselves and in our young people. And in our young people, by exhibiting it, here's the rub, we have to exhibit it ourselves. The bottom line truth is that our kids and other young people are paying very close attention. You know, the old saying was in the 70s, they have great crap detectors. They can always see a gap between what you say and what you do. If we live empathetic lives, they see and believe empathy to be a good thing and will begin to treat others with similar respect and compassion and care. And this is perhaps the greatest moral responsibility we have as parents and grandparents and adult caretakers, to express regularly and model regularly empathy and care for others, which we can then share. And several biographies of our current president say that his father gave him no training, absolutely, in kindness or empathy or decency, and look what we've got. And there is one more important piece to this empathy equation, and that's our theological beliefs. Karen Armstrong, her great book, The Great Transformation. There's the jacket of it. She asserts that in the 9th century, from the 9th to the 2nd century BCE, in other words, 9 to 200 years before the birth of Christ, which she calls the axial age, 4 distinct religious traditions, quote, that have continued to nourish humanity powerfully to the present day. These 4 traditions being Confucianism, Taoism, Confucianism and Taoism, Hinduism and Buddhism in India, monotheism in Israel, and philosophical rationalism in Greece. These 4 traditions all moved in response to the violence and the inhumanity of their age to articulate a new ethic of empathy and compassion toward human beings everywhere. I quote her, "The axial age was pivotal in the spiritual development of humanity. The prophets, mystics, philosophers, and poets of the axial age, both East and West, taught a spirituality of empathy and compassion. They insisted that people must abandon their egoism and greed, violence and unkindness, and embrace respect for the sacred rights of all persons. Each of these traditions," she writes, "developed its own formulation of what is now called the Golden Rule. The axial traditions all taught that if people behaved with kindness and generosity to their fellows, they could save the world," unquote. As Unitarian Universalists, we, of course, flow directly out of this universal ethic of the axial age, and we flow directly out of the ethics of Christianity, which developed later. Our spiritual and ethical roots are primarily Judeo-Christian and humanist, and as a faith, we have always taught the importance of compassion and connection between persons everywhere. Empathy is indeed a part of what we call ourselves. We are Unitarian Universalists. Universalists who, for the hundreds of years since our founding as a spiritual tradition, have seen and affirmed the universal, indissoluble oneness of humanity. This is our religious tradition. We are a tradition of empathy and compassion and connection. Indeed, one can say that the primary purpose of our religion is to cultivate and strengthen empathy and compassion in each of our lives. Our religion calls each of us out of the narrow confines of concern for the self. Oh God, do we need this in America today? To a wider ethic of compassion and connection with human beings everywhere. This is the soul and the substance of our religion. Connection and compassion. I want to end this morning by telling you an old tale it's an old Hasidic tale told by Elie Wiesel when he was alive, which reminds us of the power and the goodness of empathy. The story goes back to the days of the Roman Empire. It seems that a young Jew in his late teens in Jerusalem wanted to journey alone to the great city of Rome, which was then the bustling capital of the world as he knew it. A terribly exciting, adventurous destination for any young man. Well, his mother, as mothers are wont to do, protested about the dangers and difficulties of such a trip. But how will you manage? She asked him. How will you eat? Where will you sleep? Well, as an adolescent, he, of course, didn't really have any satisfactory answers. He just wanted to go on his big trip. He persisted, begging her for permission to go to Rome. Finally, his mother relented, saying, well, all right, perhaps you'll somehow make do finding food and work, but for sleep, you must take this pillow. And every night you must go outside the walls of Rome, find a nice place under a tree, and go to sleep using this pillow, so I know you will be at rest. Well, he went off to Rome, and each evening after enjoying the sights and sounds and sensations of the busy city, he did in fact venture out to the countryside, beyond the walls of a city, with his pillow and other spare belongings, to find a peaceful place to sleep. It went on like this for many days, but one night, just as the boy was falling asleep, his pillow caught fire. It spontaneously burst into flames. Wiesel, in his story, says, why was this so? The pillow caught fire that night because that night the temple in Jerusalem burned. And then Wiesel explains, it was the flames of empathy, concern, and connection with his community back home that kept the Jewish boy awake that night. Wiesel says that all Jews, no matter how far they wander from Jerusalem, mystically belong to one another in an indissoluble human community of connection and empathy. Thus it was empathy, pure and simple, that kept the boy awake that night. Causing his pillow to burst into flames was the suffering back home. So here is the bottom line this morning, dear friends. Empathy is the most important and valuable possession any of us can have, because it keeps us awake to and protective of the worth and dignity of other persons. And it increases our own humanity and worth. So may your pillow catch fire. Over your lifetime, may your heart grow in its capacity to express and embody empathy for others. May your pillow catch fire. May you evermore each become human beings who know deep to the heart of your indissoluble connection and responsibility for your fellow human beings. May your pillow catch fire. And may empathy, pure and simple, evermore infuse and ennoble your humanness. May your pillow catch fire. Amen.